understand it better than the people you're going to debate, meaning you're more familiarized with the literature. If it's NATO good, bad, understand the difference of why the US being involved or not being involved is a good thing. If it's warming, you better get on top of the warming inevitable / human cause debate. All of those are different tricks that you can add to your arsenal of being a 1 in C. Finally, this new app, don't freak out. They say new, that doesn't mean that you're screwed, right? Yes, they wrote a new app. Wow, good for them. Glad. They were smart. You can still be smart as well and read the same arguments to beat that new app. But that means you have to stay calm and prep the same way you would if it was the same app. Okay, so that's an approach to the 1 in C. I could go on a lot longer if it was like how then to move to the block, but I want to save that till later. Because you need to learn about the block separate from how you just develop the 1 in C. Any questions about the development of the 1 in C? What to do when a new app occurs? Yes?
Is it a good idea to have pre-written 1 in Cs to some apps, like the high-speed rails app?
I think it totally is, Jesse. Here's an example. You debated Grapevine. So you go to a lot of tournaments where Dallas Jesuit will go, or Green Hill, and they'll have certain affirmatives that they read all of the time. You can write a pre-written front line to each of their advantages. And you can put that in a file called Dallas Jesuit, or Green Hill, or St. Mark's. That way when they go, all right, it's the same app from these advantages, you already have done the internal link and impact work, and you don't have to pull from a different place. You should always try to do the most pre-tournament work that you can. And it's not just about being a 1 in C, it's about how you divide that division of labor amongst your debate team, right? If you're a 1 in C, I don't remember what speech you were listening, but if you were, you can't possibly write a 1 in C for every team in Texas, right? So you need to be able to split it up and find common areas. I'll handle high-speed rail advantages, this, and this. If you do Arctic pipeline, this, and this, right? And you begin to split it up so it becomes more manageable. But pre-written front line is a great idea. However, before you just read them in the debate, you need to make sure that all of your stuff is still up to date. Because if you did that work in September and now it's March, your uniqueness arguments probably need to be swapped out. So you still always need to recheck them before the debate begins. Anything else? All right.
Hey, everybody stand up. Stand up, stand up. While RJ is moving, I want you to stand up. After the block, we'll give you like a 5-minute break, but I want some of you to go over. You are inundating me with information that is super awesome.
Say we're to say something.
Seriously, stand up.
Energy rush. Yes, I have energy. I have energy. I have energy. But I have energy. Say we're to stay safe.
You didn't like sushi.
I have energy. 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 But I have energy.
Well, my mom, she just signed. I wasn't talking. We're listening. And so, like, my mom,
Irritating people.
Hey, can you move over to the right a little bit? Yellow shirt.
Hey, Tyler.
Move over to the right a little bit.
Yes.
You're in the middle of the camera. You move over to the right a little bit.
Water before I die. Although I think I'm probably dead. I like how there's 90 chords.
Get a 5-minute break. Is there a 5-minute break now?
I what do they have in Bruges? You ate there.
I know, like, I have more break. I'm gonna.
What do they have in Bruges? Whatever they have for lunch, they're gonna have for dinner.
Alright, so when RJ gets here, we can start right away. I should preview for you now that we think this information is so important that if we cut into your dinner time, it'll be alright. Questions about the first two talks on speeches? How many of you have ever gotten the opportunity to say new when somebody asks you a disclosure question? It's pretty cool. Remember that round one of the season, everybody gets to say new. The first time you are at a tournament this year, remember you get to say new. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No, so if you decide to run a new app and like Jesuit came up and said, hey, what's the app? You should say new. And then we would actually probably ask the question of new for you or new for the topic, especially early in the season, because that would give us some sense of the same kinds of questions that are accomplished with the advantage question that Lee was saying. Yeah, you just say new. But if it is not actually new, like don't be a cheater, punk, and eater. Just like actually like say it's a modification of the plan. Whenever we hand over plain text, we always say this is our most recently read plain text. And that gives us the opportunity if we need to alter something about the plain text, like we figure out that we forgot to put a period at the end of the sentence and we did not want somebody to run a period argument against us. The argument is that if you don't have a period at the end of your sentence, then it could go on forever and it's apt conditionality. So anywho, so we always say most recently read plain text. That way if we need to modify it, we can. Other questions about any of that? How many of you have ever debated a new app? I think that Louis' point of you still got to be focused and not freak out is an especially important one. Because if you freak out, then it's going to be really hard for you to put together your ideas. Also remember, your prep time is your prep time. And so you can take prep time before a cross-X. Did I just blow the mind of anyone who was listening to me?
Yes.
You can take prep time anytime you want, including before the cross-X. So if you're debating a new affirmative, it is okay after the 1AC is done to say, we'll take some prep before cross-X, get your shit together, and then proceed with stuff together, and then proceed with cross-X. Shrieker, get out of the way, you're slowing everything up. I'm not on board with that, but that's mostly because I'm jealous, because I think coaches should get to have time off too.
You take prep time with those.
Okay, Arjun's going to talk about one-off K now.
Let's begin to be split up. So I'm going to start with the basics for constructing a K1 and C creating one-off. And then I'm going to talk about 5 different kinds of apps you could be debating and how to think about a 1C against them. So the first argument of the basics is your 1C creating a one-off K should have a piece of thesis evidence. This should be the first piece of evidence that you read in your 1C. Now by thesis evidence, I don't mean it's not necessarily a linked impact or alternative part. What it does is it establishes your theory of how political reality works, of how society operates, of how oppression operates, whatever. So for example, if you're reading the Zizek Cap K, then your first piece of evidence should be a bit of a larger card about how psychoanalytic Marxism accurately explains social relations and status quo. If I'm reading the Heidegger K, then my first piece of evidence needs to be one that establishes that ontology should be an important consideration for politics. It is right now not. It is undervalued and underconsidered in the status quo, and it shapes political action. This is important for a couple of reasons. First is that the 2AC answers your link and impact arguments, and they make them all dolphins and stuff like that, but they don't answer the thesis, the piece of thesis evidence you've read, then that nullifies a lot of their arguments. If you read a piece of evidence that says capitalism explains social relations, and they read some, right-wing backlash and blah, 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 what you can say is we control the direction of how politics operates right now. We control uniqueness on the question of the alternative. There's no possibility of a right-wing backlash. There's no possibility of alternative terms. There's only a chance we make things better. It also means that, or if part of your evidence says that true capitalism does not exist, we live in some sort of proto-fascist capitalism, whatever, then you can group their capitalism impact terms and be like, you have conceded that the world that we live in is not true capitalism. All of these pieces of evidence that you've read are idealizations that nobody accesses. The second reason why a piece of thesis evidence is good is because you can establish epistemology arguments. If I read a piece of evidence that says that, I'm reading the Spanos K, I'm reading a critique of some sort of war impact that one AC is read. If my evidence indicates that ontology, the way that I think about being in the world, influences the knowledge that I produce in the world, then they can read a bunch of cards for like threats are real, we gotta talk about agreement and liberty, and I can be like, you have conceded our argument that ontology shapes the way that knowledge gets produced. Even if the affirmative is correct, threats are real, empirical knowledge is good, the question of the ontological, how we think about ourselves as beings, is a prior consideration before you evaluate the truth claims of their impacts. The third reason as to why thesis evidence is good is because it can establish alternative solvency arguments, and it can establish arguments that you can use for the framework. If I read my evidence about ontology shaping politics, it's already in the 1C. It's true of how all political action operates, then I'm already a step ahead once I get to the alternative debate. Or once I get to the framework debate. I win. You cannot create politics outside of the way that we think about politics. Which means that they can't just wish away the critique. Because even the 1AC itself has embedded ideological assumptions that have to be interrogated. There's no world outside of ontology. Now, after you've read your thesis evidence, the K has basic structure. You want to make linked arguments, which are both to the plan and the advantages, so maybe a different one for each, or if it's really sweet, some card that ties the plan to the advantages. So, on the immigration topic for college, one of the affirmatives was H-1B, provide temporary worker visas. And a lot of affirmatives read an international competitiveness advantage, very similar to the high-speed rail. We had a piece of evidence that actually said when you advocate the H-1B and use competitiveness as your justification, then we end up viewing all of these workers as tools for promoting national identity. Pieces of evidence like that are tight. And you should make sure that you read them whenever they read that advantage with that plain text, because it allows for you to make a very specific link argument that makes the permutation very difficult for them, and it also allows for you to make very specific dissatisfied link arguments that make alternative solvency less relevant. What I mean by that is, if I control a very specific link argument, what the plan does, I'm like, what the plan does in conjunction with their advantages is really, really bad, then there's a much lower threshold for me to prove the alternative generates uniqueness. If the plan does something really uniquely bad, then I don't have to win that I change that. All I have to win is that you should not do that, because it is different from the status quo's way of doing things. Now, the impact debate, you want to have an external impact, some sort of like what they do, the way they think, or it's going to cause war, it's going to cause environmental destruction of some sort, your traditional impacts, like a disad. You're also going to want to have some sort of K-ish impact, something that you can use to outweigh their extinction advantage, something like ethics or value of life. Those are the two traditional K impacts that can be used to weigh against extinction risks. Now, the alternative, it really depends. I gave my lecture on debating different alternatives with the three different big genres of Ks, so you're going to want to have it all. You always want to have it all. Even if your alt is just kind of like a rejection or do nothing alt, you want to establish to the judge what they're voting for. It's very easy for a judge to just traditionally assume that the debate's going to be a plan versus a counterpoint versus a status quo. When you read a critique, even if a judge is open to the idea of critiques, people don't always have a pre-established framework for how to evaluate Ks. They don't know. So you need to give them a way of evaluating the K. What it means for the ballot. Is the judge just endorsing what you've done and saying, I'm a good person? Is your judge theoretically imagining a utopian world of communism? What are they doing? You need to establish that for the judge. After that, you need to have a case debate. I cannot think of a single scenario where you don't need to read the case. I'll get into the specifics about that on the different kinds of affirmatives, but case is uniquely important if I'm reading a critique that does not embeddedly answer one of the advantages. So let's say the affirmative is they do something and they have a big environment advantage, but then they also have a little war advantage. Well, if I read I can read my environment K, but then what I have to do is I have to read cards on the war advantage to try and minimize its importance. That way I don't spread myself thin trying to read a new K of each advantage or try to win that the K independently outweighs the second advantage. It's fine for me to read a K that is predominantly towards the bigger advantage of the app as long as I win a lot of case defense or offense to the second advantage. I'm going to go ahead. Another thing I wanted to say is that you should not think of links as just a connection between the plan and the impact. You should think of each link argument as a potential independent disadd. Think about whenever I was going for the Virilio K. Each link argument, my first link argument, had an independent value to life impact. The second link argument independently turned the advantages. So if the 1AR concedes one of those link arguments and they think they've answered the whole K, they have dropped a whole disadd. An entire disadd. And this will become more important a little bit later when I talk about debating far right alternatives. Okay, the 5 different kinds of apps. The first is the K app. If you're debating an affirmative that says that they solve oppression, being mean in some way, shape, or form, whatever they claim to solve for, what you need to do is you need to establish first, what do they do? Do they advocate something? Do they defend a policy, implement a plan? Some critical affirmatives do. Some key affirmatives don't. But it's very important that you establish in cross-examination exactly how the app defends the plan. You need to ask them, do you defend the plan happens? Do you think a world in which the federal government actually does this is a good idea? And then be specific, so if we argue that increasing investment for transportation infrastructure is bad, will you say, no link, we don't do that? You need to say something that explicit. And if they say yes or no, well, that determines how you should structure your K. If they say no, then your K is going to have to be a very method-oriented K. What I mean by that is like a capitalism K is very much structured on the idea we have to combat capitalism a priori. Or maybe you're reading a whiteness argument. Your argument is we have to combat whiteness through a genealogy, through making whiteness visible, etc. Some sort of method needs to be used to try and counteract whatever the app's method is. After you've established that they don't defend a plan that gets implemented, you need to figure out what exactly it is that they do. Like I said earlier with y'all, is the app asking the judge to endorse them? Is the app asking the judge to theoretically envision something? What is it? What is it about the voting affirmative that connects to their solvency arguments? Do not allow them to get away with just, we have said something is bad, vote F. They have to do something. They have to advocate something. And if they do not prove that they do something in a strong manner, you should make an argument about why that is an inadequate reason to vote affirmative and you should vote negative on presumption. This goes very well with the Nietzsche style, okay, which, I'll talk about a little bit later. What else? Whenever you're debating a critique affirmative, this debate is going to be a lot more about link and permutation. So whenever you're structuring your 1AC, you need to think about what the 2AR is going to be going for. The 2AR is probably going to be going for an argument about why you can combine whatever the app's method is with whatever the neg's method is. So the 1AC needs to be good on making specific link arguments that not only are just links to what the app does, but actually assume the permutation. So if the affirmative is reading a racism bad affirmative, and I am reading the capitalism critique, I should include a link about intersectionality. Intersectionality is the idea that we define multiple different types of oppression. I need to not just read link arguments that focusing on race is bad. I need to read link arguments that go ahead and presume that they are going to make a permutation. Because if they know they're affirmative in any way, shape, or form, they're going to do that. The impact debate, it really depends. Sometimes you're going to have to win. No, capitalism explains the impact better than yours do. But sometimes, I'll say a lot of times you're debating something where both teams agree imperialism is bad or something like that. Well, in the 1C, you're going to have your turns case arguments, and the impact debate, you're going to have some sort of root cause debate, but you're going to have to remember to put some sort of external impact in there. If the 1AC's impact is imperialism, do not read another piece of imperialism bad evidence in your K. Read some sort of external impact, like the app is about political imperialism, like literally intervening into other countries. Our case about ontological imperialism, trying to enforce your ideas on other people. Make some sort of impact distinction, because you need to have an external impact going into the 2 R. Otherwise, it's going to be very easy for the app to say, we're both going for the same impact, so there's probably a better chance that we solve our impact since we know more about our app than you do. Any questions about the K app? Right now? Do you have one?
If you have two of the same impacts, we have to create a framework for two.
Well, if you're debating a critical affirmative, the framework issue, there's a high likelihood the app is not going to be like fiat good, you don't get your K. So there won't be as much of a framework debate. You should think of it more just like an impact calculus debate. You need to be saying that what the app does causes something bad. Not only do they cause their own harms, but you need to demonstrate that they cause something else bad. So if the app says imperialism is bad, I need to read a piece of evidence that, if I'm reading the capitalism is the root cause of imperialism, but capitalism also causes external other bad things. Did that answer your question? I'm going to go ahead and go on to middle of the road apps. So by a middle of the road app, what I mean is that the app says something like, right now Syria is cracking down on protesters. That's going to cause a big bad war that kills everybody. The plan is to try and aid these protesters so that, Syria stops Damascus quits cracking down on them. So the app's not really doing anything mean. They're not saying like we need to kill certain people, we've got to be hegemons and influence other people's American values. They're saying something much more moderate to try and get out of your K-links. Now, it is not a good idea to just say, well, you're still imperialist because you intervened in a country. It is insufficient for you to just say, well, you're pretty much one of the right-wing apps. What you need to do is you need to read a critique and link arguments that presume the spin of the affirmative. Your link should not just be, oh, well, you intervened and are messing in foreign politics. Your link should be, we intervene and mess in foreign politics with humanitarianism as the garb in which we dress it. The app is not just a little bit more moderate than the right wing. The app is just a nice way of doing what the right is doing, which means that it's actually worse because it's in sheep's clothing. Whenever they, and another thing that makes this link argument work very well is a good case debate. If you have a good solvency debate about where the app's money or their support is actually going to go, if you have good evidence that says, the high-speed rail is not going to go to people that are poor, or to places where more minorities live, or it's not going to work very well for X reason. In any of these solvency arguments, strongly bolster your link claims, that they are just trying to put out some sort of victims that they're helping to try and make the rest of what they're doing look a lot better. A good solvency debate is very important for the middle of the road app because then all they're stuck with is the part of the app that is more right-wing. What's up, Victoria? Well, it depends on what your link evidence is. I think that a majority of your link arguments that are tied to like the thesis of your K need to be off case. If you have a link to another K, so like, let's say that the app is, it's a high-speed rail, they have some advantage that depends upon economic explanations of human behavior. It's got a war impact, and they've got something else. Well, I think what you should do is just read, you want to read Nietzsche. Just read your Nietzsche K, maybe we have a link to the plan, link to what they do, like they try and decrease suffering, they try and decrease war, that's bad, and then whatever. On the case, if you have a specific economics type link, it's not a bad idea to read that on the case. If the app is already going to link, you don't need to prove and win that they link, then it's fine for you to go ahead and read your specific link to their advantage on that advantage, yes. But do not read your, you decrease suffering, that's bad. You try and get rid of war, that's bad on the advantage. That's more of an off-case kind of link, because it's more of a thesis type argument. Now, whenever you're reading a middle-of-the-road app, one thing that's really important is that you've got to make sure that you know what the alt does. Because the affirmative is going to go very hard on, even if you're right what we do is mean, the status quo is way worse. It is protesters getting shot in the head for expressing their opinions. What do you do about that? Do you do nothing? There are two ways in which you can approach this. One, explain how intervention could have happened in other ways. You could have said, no, intervening would be good in the abstract, but all of your war impacts demonstrate that you don't really care about the protesters. The point of the act is really to try and solve nuclear war. If you had just stopped your 1AC at the part where they were talking about protesters, that would have been sufficient, but you didn't. Which means that's more telling about what your true intentions are. Maybe read a piece of evidence here about how the way that intervention solidifies itself is by, hiding behind victims again. Or just cross by your 1AC evidence says this. The second argument you can make is say you have to defend not doing anything. You have to say intervention will just make things worse. You don't know enough about what's going on over there. Or we shouldn't do anything because we are not obligated to help those people. Maybe we need to fix something going on here first. Maybe you're Nietzsche and you're just like, we shouldn't care about anything because feeling guilty is bad. Your alternative needs to have some sort of answer to the question of, do you just let protesters get shot? It is insufficient to be like, well, we got to reject imperialism, though. You have to directly answer the question of whether you would do something and intervene. All right. The third kind of affirmative you can debate is a pared down 1AC. What I mean by this is sometimes a team will read their plan text, read a very short advantage and solvency argument, and then for like 5 or 6 minutes, will just read preempts to your K. This will happen to you a lot if all you go for is critiques, and you're debating a team that doesn't really want to debate your K. They will just kind of want to sandbag you, they want to try and overwhelm you. If they are technically more proficient than you are, this is probably a strategy they're going to try and implement. Now, a good way to set up and think about your 1AC whenever you're debating this is to try and read a critique that the preempts do not apply to. Does everybody know what I mean about preempts? I mean, like, let's say I'm reading an app, and my app is, high-speed rail, and I'm just going to read my competitiveness advantage. Now I'm going to read a bunch of cards that are like, ontological focus is bad, and critique see the political, and postmodernism is bad, value to life is subjective. I'm going to read a bunch of cards that I think already answer your critique, so that I think I can have a head up. Now, what you should do when they do this is read a critique that none of their preempts apply to. If they read a bunch of ontology bad, see the political, value to life kind of cards, you should then stand up and read the capitalism K. And say, you're right, ontology is stupid. You shouldn't see the political, we should take active material actions in the world. You are already ahead of the debate because they have read 3 minutes of cards that do not apply to your critique. You should read either that or a K of the plan. You should be like, transportation infrastructure is materially bad. It's not just an ontological question. It's not just a value life question. What you do is bad. It causes global wars for X reason. Now, you need to think, whenever you're constructing your 1AC, you think about what the app's going to do. If they're paring down their app, what they're going to try and do is probably just really defend that one advantage and then go hard on no link, we don't do anything else mean, we're not meaning anybody, blah, blah, blah. So this debate is going to be more about the alternative and the method debate. And it may be about the link or impact. It really depends. You're going to have to make a judgment call. Think about what the 1AC is doing. Think about what this team is, what you know about them, and decide whether they're going to try and go for the no link or they're going to go for the just this advantage is good. If the affirmative is just a plan that just has a big warming advantage, they're probably just going to go for no link. We did not do anything mean. We're just trying to solve warming, and warming is really bad. Here's much science. If their one advantage is hegemony, then they're probably going to go big on, we have a bunch of cards that just say this one impact is true, realism is good, war is inevitable, we've got to try and kill bad people. If it's the latter, then you need to load up on your impacts. If it's the former, then you need to try and read a critique that either controls the root cause of improper construction and warming, or just read like 3 or 4 good, solid impacts. You should be like, you've got one advantage. Now we're going to read a bunch of cases as to why you don't solve that advantage. Now we're going to have 4 impacts to our K. We massively outweigh what you've done. Let's see. For the most part, this is a very subjective thing. Some people try and answer all the preempts, some people do not. I think that you do not need to answer the preempts. The reason being, they have not applied these arguments to your critique yet. I do not think it is necessary. It's the 1AC. I do not think that the 1AC should be able to make arguments and treat it like they have just read their 2AC answers. For example, I do not think it's okay for the 1AC to read their topicality 2AC and the 1AC. The 1AC can read cards that say that, our affirmative is topical, here's some evidence that supports that, but I think the 1AC cannot stand up and be like, and we mean topicality and counterprediction and topicality voting issue. In the 1AC, I would not think it's necessary for me to answer each of those arguments. I can just read my shell. Similarly, if they read a bunch of preempts, if you think you've got the goods and you just want to go ahead and debate them on it, you think you're going to beat them on that debate, go ahead. Go to the preamps page, read your cards, ontology's tight, value of life's not subjective, you actually kill it, and we're political. If not, just it's totally try and escape it. And just be like, when you have applied these arguments, then we will answer them in the 2AC. Alright. Next affirmative is a more right-wing style of affirmative. Some people will try and run from your critique, some will run head first. Some teams will say, you're right, we're so evil, we're so bad, but truth is real, we gotta kill the bad people because the bad people are gonna kill us otherwise. Everything we've said is correct, you don't do anything because hippies are bad. This affirmative will say something like, the Gemini military primacy are good, and we gotta kill all the terrorists, something along those lines. One thing that I want you to acknowledge is, okay, this F links. Whatever you're about to say, they link. They don't care. They're probably not gonna make a big no-link argument. They're probably not going to have a big permutation debate. If they do, it's just going to be a distraction. They're just trying to beat you on a silly technicality. So have that in mind. What you should focus on is still reading specific links, because it'll make dealing with them permanently easy, and you can still treat them as independent dissets. Especially when you know that the affirmative is not going to try and beat you on a no-link debate. It's going to be much easier for you to be like, okay, well, they dropped this link. We have a specific disset tied to this link. This independently turns the F, independently outweighs the F, go ahead and vote nay. So while you should know, I don't have to win the link in the sense of proving that the F does something bad, you should know reading very specific links is still very advantageous. So for example, last year I debated an affirmative that said we have to provide democracy assistance only to non-violent Muslims. And then they read a bunch of cards that were like, there is a real difference, some Muslims are violent, some are not, we should only give it to those people. And I read, so obviously they acknowledge, they're like, the war on terror is tight, we gotta kill the bad Muslims. And they obviously are going to link. However, I still had two different link arguments. My first was a tolerance argument. It's that whenever the government establishes that a certain group of people, that part of them are okay and part of them are bad, then that just creates a new form of racism. Where we can say those that look like us and act like us are okay, and those that aren't are worse. I have a racism dissent. My second argument could be more of just a traditional war on terror bad argument, with my war impacts and my ethics impacts and whatever. But I still have two separate dissets here. And it's very likely the affirmative is structured to answer the second one very well, and not the first one very well. I have a racism impact. That probably means you shouldn't trust any of the impacts they claim because they all come from a racist perspective. Probably has its own independent ethics advantage, and racism is a persuasive impact if you execute it well and argue that it outweighs the F. Another thing you need if you're debating the right-wing F, the alternative debate is going to be different. They might spot you that you get rid of the war on terror, you get rid of imperialism, they're just going to go ahead and impact trends. Or they might just say, transition wars, you try and move away and that's bad. The alternative debate could be important. So in the 1 and C, go ahead and read your alt, or read your alt that's more about the advantage and less about the plan. If you have an alternative that says, we should move away from transportation, that might be important. But I think that if the F is just like transportation, now here's 7 minutes of hedge cards, you should go ahead and read your alternative that says it's possible to create alternative modes of being outside of hedge, or critiques of international relations are successful and lead to political change. Your alt should be much more structured in the 1 and C around solving the advantage uniqueness argument. It's also very important to have a big solid epistemology argument in the 1 and C, so that way you can win that yes, the F may win that they outweigh all of our impacts, but we will win you should not trust their arguments. I've explained epistemology a couple of times now, whenever I give my lecture and right now, so I think that's sufficient. Does anybody have any questions about setting up the 1 and C against the right-wing type of affirmative? Has anyone read a critique against an F that sounds like this? Y'all have? Read. Alright. Maybe? Alright. But does everybody understand what you should be thinking about, how you should be setting it up? Because remember, one thing I want you all to think about is the 1 and C, like Scott said, you don't want to think of the 1 and C as just let's plow through this and the debate will start later. The 1 and C should not be set up to just make the 2AC answer something. The 1 and C should be set up to go ahead and beat the 2AR. If you know this team is going to go for seed the political and they're going to go for case outweighs, your 1 and C should be a seed the political answers and case outweighs bad is that. You should be like, framing extinction is coming first is bad, here's a bunch of cards, and believing that the political only resides in the government is bad, here's a bunch of cards. Set up the 1 and C to beat the 2AR. The 2AC cannot beat you. Even if the 2AC makes some really good arguments and you mess up, blah, 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 only the 2AR can beat you. You got to beat the 2AR. Start the 1 and C. All right, the last staff that I want to talk about that's a little bit strange is I have 30 advantages there. Sometimes we'll debate a team that has an environment impact. They got a warming impact, biodiversity impact. They have a nuclear war impact. They have a social justice. We've got to help save these people impact. They have a scenario for war in Africa, one in East Asia, blah, blah, blah. Now, there are 2 ways to approach this. If you're like, man, I'm super technical, I'm super fast, I can totally just out-tech this team, have at it. Read your imperialism K, read your environment K, read your other K, and just out-tech them. I think that in most scenarios, if you're reading a critique and you want to read the one-off critique, your strength is probably going to be more explanation and less about technical skills. And the flip side of that is that if the app is reading 30 advantages, their skill set is probably more oriented towards technical execution and less oriented towards deep explanations. So what you should do against this app, most likely, is you can either read a 1 and C that has a good root cause sort of argument. The capitalism case is very good for this. Capitalism being the root cause for everything, there's so many cards to establish that. Then you don't have to beat each advantage. You don't have to try and make sure that, okay, K transfers 1 for this reason, K transfers 2 for this reason. You can just say, we win the capitalism is the biggest impact around because it explains war, environmental destruction, and genocide. And then all it's a question of is who solves capitalism better. You can do the same thing with imperialism. Or what you can do is read a Nietzsche critique and just say, make it more about death, make it more about the terminal impact. Everything you've said is only bad because it causes death. We're going to go ahead and engage you and beat you on the value of life debate. You're going to want to load up on your impact debate. Not just on, we have 4 impacts, but more on whatever the impact of the K is, outweighs a bunch of scenarios of the F. Another thing, let's move to it. The alternative, it's going to be just as important as debating any other app. It's not going to be a focus of the debate if they have 30 advantages. The focus of the debate is going to be, let's see if the neg drops 1. So you need to try and have more of a meta argument. Try and win more of an ontology explains more scenarios for violence, more of a big epistemology sort of argument in the 1 and C. Do not try and read a critique and just be like, well, we have a bunch of impacts too. You need to win that you control the root of a lot of the affirmative advantages. So what I said about the KF. With the KF, you need to try and win that you have some sort of external impact that's isolated, correct? While that's still important for this K, you need to think strategically about doing the opposite. I need to win that a lot of my impacts subsume the F's impacts. So that way they can't win. Fine, you win your security K, you win, you cause genocide, we have an environment advantage. Totally external for everything you've said. Net benefit return. You gotta try to make sure you win a root cause argument or some sort of meta level ethics or value to life argument that outweighs that. And that should be how you set up your K and pick your 1 and C. Any questions about that? All right, any more general questions about the 1 and C whenever you want to read a one-off K? What's up?
So like, to have any good K, you said that you need like a root cause argument?
Not all K require root cause arguments. That's just one way of framing your impacts that can be very persuasive. So with the middle of the road app, it's not as important. The middle of the road app, you're more about proving that what they do is just as bad as the people they're trying to hate on, or they don't really do what they're trying to do. But that's more about a link sort of debate. The pared down 1AC, root cause can be important. Right wing, you're not really going to win that capitalism is the, you're not really going to win imperialism is the root cause of terrorism. You might, but I don't think that one's more about root cause. I think that one's more about don't trust the app's advantages. They're all lying. Really, really build up that debate and win like something external like ethics, value to life, and then just debate them on, are there real people? This one's much more about whether you trust the app's impacts or not. So the ones where you really got to win the root cause, you got to read a good root cause argument, and it's the 30 advantages type app, and KF, the pared down 1AC. What's up, Michelle? Give me your cards, by the way. Just let me send me your file. In verbatim.
Oh, okay. For the 1C, I know it probably depends on how much case do you think you should
It depends. So if the 1AC has 2 advantages and your K is built very well to handle both, so So I read the Heidegger K, I have a war and I have an environment impact, and the 1AC advantage is just war and environment, then you should read some. Try and make sure they don't solve their app, try and make sure they don't blah. But that's not as important. If the advantage, let's say I'm reading the imperialism K, it's got to be a war impact, but the app also has an environment advantage, then you need to front load that environment advantage because your K doesn't deal with it very well at all. It's more of a judgment call. I'd say for the most part, you probably want at least 2 minutes of case in the 1C, the 1-off K. I think it is perfectly fine, if you're speaking for 8 minutes, to have a 1NC K that's 4.5 minutes, and then you read 3.5 minutes of case. I think that's great. Case is no risk option. If I'm reading my off-case K, and I read more link arguments, more impact cards, the 2AC doesn't have to spend more time on those. And the 2AC's impact terms will still apply. If I read 4 minutes of case defense, the 2AC can answer all of that, and they can't make an offensive argument. They can't turn the you don't solve your F argument. They can't be like, well, we really solve our F now, voting issue. It doesn't exist. They can't straight turn case defense. Oh, another thing I forgot to talk about too was you should also, if there's another advantage that's external, you shouldn't just read case defense, but you can read mini case there as offense. So if the app has a big environmental, we solve environment, we solve warming advantage, then you should read your, capitalism K, capitalism is the root cause of the environment, or you should read your Heidegger K, ontological materials the root cause. And then if they have a war advantage too, just read a little threat construction K there. Read a little securitization K there. Something like that. That's always useful. You don't read its own at all, just treat it like an impact turn to that advantage, and that works great. You have a question, Ajay? Yes. Ajay's question was if you have a bunch of cases you want to read, what you should generally do is read your off-case position, read your other case on case, and try and find some sort of reason why what your K does solves it. So if you're reading the cap K and then you read a securitization K on case, you should say you should read a piece of evidence on this that the reason why we securitize is because we're afraid of poor countries getting nuclear weapons because then they can fight the expansion of global capitalism. Make some reason as well what the alternative does, generates uniqueness for your little K's on case, or just say you don't have to win uniqueness. You can just win that it takes out the advantage or turns it. It'll be harder to win that it's offense, but it won't be that hard to win. Their impacts are constructed, and they might cause more wars, so war is inevitable under the app. They can't solve this advantage. What's up, Victoria? Yes, you can do that. So I gave this advantage. I think I gave this example last time when I was lecturing. But I saw a debate where one team went for a politics disad that had a more moderate kind of impact, and then went for a critique of hegemony on case as just a case term. And they won on this takes out the advantage because threats to hegemony are constructed. They didn't read it all. They went for politics. They went for a disad. But as long as they don't double turn, then yeah, it should be fine. Any other questions? Okay, cool.
It's not really maintenance. Okay, so the 2AC is one of the most strategic speeches in the debate. It sets up how you can win the debate on the affirmative, right? You cannot make an argument in the 2AR or go for an argument in the 2AR if it is not presented originally in the 2AC. So you've heard the 1AC, the 1NC discussions. Now you kind of have a base in order to frame how you should approach the 2AC. Scott made the point that sustainability is important for the affirmative, and that's especially true for the 2AC. I'm going to kind of start off with the research and 2AC research is something that's done prior to tournaments as much as possible and when you're cutting the attribution. There's another element of research that's strategic, especially for the 2AC. There is a wiki in high school debate where people post arguments that they read on the affirmative and the negative. You should know who reads the same app as you, who reads similar advantages to you, so that you can see teams that they've debated and 1NCs against their app. Prior to tournaments, you should look up all of the negative arguments that have been introduced to the high school debate topic. You should have prepared 2AC blocks to them. This is part of the preparation, right? You should time those 2AC blocks so you know how long they'll take you, so you can allocate your speech time when you're thinking about how to approach the 2AC during the debate round. You should prepare uniqueness updates to arguments like politics and spending and time-sensitive arguments, uniqueness arguments on your advantage, etc. These are all things you can do before the tournament happens to help you be better prepared on the affirmative. There are generic tips that'll make your 2AC important, right? So one of those is prioritization. You should prioritize what you can lose on, right? Everybody puts topicality on first because it's a priority issue. If you lose T, you lose the debate round, right? However much time you spend on that would be whether or not your app is topical. If it's not topical, you should probably spend some more time on it. Then you put their most negatives and you put your case debate, right? Because you want to answer all the case arguments so that you have that offense, that 8 minutes from the 1AC to use against the other positions the 1AC presented. And then you want to kind of allocate time accordingly, like what is the negative's most offensive argument? How long does your 2AC block take for this argument? Which argument should you answer first? Those are all time allocation strategy questions you should ask yourself before approaching the 2AC. And you should approach this by thinking ahead, right? Debates are won and lost in the 2NR and the 2AR, right? You need to know, going into the 2AC, every possible way the 2NR could win the debate round. Louis talked about this: counterplan, disad case, K case. There's 4 ways, I think I totally didn't count, so I might be agreeing with that. There are 4 ways that the 2NR could win the debate. You should have offense to every argument, and you should have a strategy for the 2AR for every possible way that the 2NR could win the debate round. You should always use 1AC evidence, right? Your 1AC cards were picked because they're the best cards, because they assume certain defensive arguments, because they have your solvency advocate in them. They answer counterplans, they answer case terms, they answer case defense, they answer disads, they outweigh disads. You should use those pieces of evidence before reading new cards, right? Not instead of reading more cards, but in addition to reading more cards. You should use the warrants from your 1AC evidence. So now I'm going to kind of talk about the different 1NCs and how you would approach them, right? So you have RG's 1NC where you have a big one-off in case debate. And then you have Louis' 1NC where you have like 7-off in case debate. The first one, the one-off K debate, there are a couple of generic ways to approach it, and then some specific things you want to do to kind of make sure the debate is more on your side. The generic things you want to do in every big debate with kind of one-offs case, you want to diversify your offense. You don't want to read 13, see the political cards, and be like, I'm done. I want to see the political debate. You need other areas of offense. You need impact-driven questions. You need a framework. You need an answer to role of the ballot. You need an answer to root cause arguments. You need link defense. You need impact terms, or you need link terms, right? You need to approach it with a diversity of offense. And I'll kind of talk about that when I talk about the specific ways you would answer a one-off case. You should know if it's more than one criticism. They may say one sheet of paper. They may not have an order because order is hierarchical. I don't know. But that's silly argument. Also, you should know if it's multiple authors, if it's multiple criticisms put into one, then you should be aware of that. You should make sure that you have offense against most of the strategies, the different ways the 2NR could approach it, right? If it makes an imperialism argument and a capitalism argument, you need to have offense because the 2NR could jettison one of those and go for a different portion, right? They could go for one link scenario as opposed to like 8 different link scenarios. That's a really important part of RJ's speech, that each link argument on a criticism is a separate negative strategy. They all have separate impacts if they're done correctly. So as a 2A, you need to answer every specific link argument on the criticism. You need to say, if you're link turning it, how the permutation does not link to the criticism, how it would resolve that link argument, it would solve that link argument, and why it doesn't apply to the app. If you're impact turning it, you need to impact turn that specific link argument. You need to identify what the impact framing should be. Things like utilitarianism, consequentialism. Do you want to go into the ontology data? You're doing a critical 1AC. You need to set up a framing question so that the negative cannot control the way that the impact should be carried throughout the data. You need to identify what the K framework is. Is it an ontology question? Is it an epistemology question? Did they make an argument about how there's a prior question and a structuring argument? You need to know how they're going to frame the debate so that you can, first of all, get offense under their framework, and second of all, provide a counter framework that best suits your offense. Those type of even-if strategies where you're making arguments about how you fit in their framework and how another framework is a better option sets you up so that even if they win their framework arguments, you have offense in that framework. You need to identify key things that K-debaters like to say and win on. Things like value to life, case turn arguments. If they make a case, turns the case argument in the 1NC, you need to answer it specifically in the 2AC on the K-debate. If they make a root cause argument, if they make a goal of the ballot argument, these are specific things you have to address in your 2AC or you'll be behind. We need to make uniqueness meta-level arguments. Is capitalism inevitable, right? If they make the argument that extinction is inevitable, and you can see extinction is inevitable and all of your impacts are extinction, but they win that extinction is inevitable absent the alternative, it's kind of irrelevant if you solve extinction. Because it's inevitable. It'll happen some other way, right? You just have to address what the impact framing should be and get offense under their impact framing and present a counter impact framing that makes your scenarios more preferable. You should have epistemological defenses of your advantages, reasons why they're true, reasons why your arguments are based in studies, they're based in history, they're based in something to prove that your epistemology isn't flawed, right? You should have critical defenses of your 1AC when you're doing research of the advantages. Whether that means reading a more critical 1AC when you're debating K-teams, or just straight up defending your policy advantages. You should have approached that question prior to the round. An important part of this is cross-X, right? You need to set up your 2AC and cross-X. You need to have discussions with your 1A outside of debate. You should maybe be friends, if you're not, you should still talk, right? What kind of arguments, what kind of discussion do you need to have in certain debate rounds? If it's a one-off K debate, what questions do you need me to ask so that you can be prepared to give your 2AC? Right? In K debates, you should always ask, will the alternative ever result in the affirmative? If it's a counterclaim debate, you should always ask, what's the status of the counterclaim? If there's more than one K, you should probably ask what the status is of the K, right? And even if it is a one-off K debate, you can still ask the status because they could go for a link argument as a case term and jettison the alternative. So you shouldn't just presume it's unconditional. They can ask questions about what would result in a world of the alternative to help you get impact on the ground. They can ask questions about the politics of the alternative to help you get disats to the alternative. That's another important aspect of one-off K debate, and even if there's more off positions, 2As sometimes underutilize the alternative, which is the weakest part of the criticism usually. There's a lot of offense you can read against alternatives and defense about why it doesn't solve the app right, why it's an ineffective method, whatever. That's something that you should have in your 2AC in every debate where there's a criticism. A response to the alternative, why it doesn't generate uniqueness for the link arguments, why it wouldn't resolve link arguments, why it wouldn't solve the advantages or the root cause of the advantages. Those will help you to make your offense it's a 7 off debate, right? You have to prioritize how you approach that 2AC. Do you want to straight turn arguments? Or do you just want to like read every card you can possibly read on every argument? You should think about what the 2&R could do, right? If you straight turn a disad and the counter plan solves your offense on that disad, they don't have to spend the time on the disad. They can still kick the disad, right? You need to know that the strategy of straight turning an argument means the negative is stuck with it. But if there's a K or a counter plan that would resolve your offense in some way, i.e. the reason the impact of the offense is relevant or the genericness of the turn is solved by the counter plan, it means that that straight turn is no longer a strategy question because the negative can get out of it. So you should think about if there are disads that are not net benefits to the counter plan that you want a straight turn so that the negative has to respond to those disads, right? Even if they go for the counter plan. If you have specific link terms that the counter plan can't solve, they can't just ignore your offense. You've made it hard for the block because they have to go for a disad that is not a net benefit to the counter plan, or at least answer your offense on it, which takes some time. Which means you should know the 2&R options. You should know if they have a disad case strategy or a counter plan disad, the different ways they can win the debate. You should know that going into the 2AC so that you can prioritize your decision making. If it's a time question because there are like 7 or 8 off, right? You should think, they read 3 minutes of defense on my warming advantage. Should I just read an add-on and kick that advantage, right? Or do I want to save that for the 1AR? So think ahead, right? If you have more than one advantage in your 1AC and you are really, really time pressured in the 2AC and you're going to concede a major argument that'll hurt you, maybe you want to jettison an advantage and save some time. Don't be repetitive. When it's a big debate like this, you can do your impact questioning or your impact extensions on the case debate and not on every flow, right? You've extended your impact. You don't have to do it 7 times. You should do it once, though. Everybody, if you're 2A, extend your impacts. Watch some debates. You should write that down.